Diego hated his neighbor Robert Martinez, the 72-year-old man who had been his personal nightmare in Summit, New Jersey, calling the police at every sound, sending inspectors for every renovation, turning his life into an endless series of problems. He was the kind of surly neighbor who makes you consider moving to another city just for peace. But one freezing February morning changed everything when Diego saw Bob struggling through the snow with a strange medical device on his back. In 30 seconds, Diego made a decision that would reveal one of the most extraordinary secrets he'd ever heard. His troubled neighbor had dedicated 40 years to the CIA's most secretive operations, photographing critical moments in history and serving on missions that influenced the fate of nations. This is a true story of how a simple act of kindness broke a former spy's decades of isolation and forged a friendship that would change two lives forever. If you stick around until the end, you'll hear the recording Bob made before he died, a testament that will touch your heart in an unforgettable way. Subscribe to the channel and like it because you won't want to miss stories like this. Let's begin. Diego never imagined that his move to Summit, New Jersey would be marked by so many conflicts with his neighbor. Robert Martinez, or Bob, as he insisted on being called, was the kind of person who turned any simple situation into a gigantic problem. The 72-year-old lived alone in the house next door, a red brick building that looked like it had come straight out of the 1960s. He was extremely methodical, reclusive by nature, and seemingly dedicated his entire life to monitoring everything that happened in the neighborhood. Diego soon realized he had chosen the wrong place to live in peace. The first few weeks were a veritable inferno of complaints and calls to authorities. When Diego and his mother decided to renovate the front stairs, Bob immediately contacted the city inspectors, claiming they didn't have a permit. The following weekend, during a backyard barbecue, Bob called both the police and the fire department, convinced the smoke indicated an impending fire. The situation was so absurd that Diego began to wonder if his neighbor was mentally ill. It was impossible to carry out any normal activity without Bob finding a reason to complain or call the authorities. What irritated Diego most was the complete lack of direct communication between them. Bob never knocked on the door to discuss his problems. Instead, he preferred the more complicated route, calling inspectors, the police, the fire department, anyone who might cause trouble for the neighbors. Diego tried to understand the logic behind this behavior, but it was impossible. The man seemed to delight in creating trouble, as if it were his main hobby in his retirement days. Bob's house was a mystery in itself. All the windows remained closed and covered with heavy curtains, preventing any view inside. Diego never saw anyone visiting his neighbor, not relatives, not friends, not service providers. It was as if Bob lived in complete isolation, leaving only for essential errands like shopping and doctor's appointments. Sometimes Diego wondered how anyone could live so alone, but his dislike for his neighbor always overcame his curiosity. Bob's behavior was as predictable as it was irritating. Any sound after 7 p.m. resulted in a call to the police, even if it was within the legal noise limits. Diego discovered he could make noise until 10 p.m., but Bob didn't care about the official rules. For him, 7 p.m. was the absolute limit, and any violation of this personal rule warranted action by the authorities. It was like living with an unofficial neighborhood police officer, someone who had appointed himself the guardian of local order. Diego began to develop a genuine dislike for Bob Martinez. The man represented everything Diego detested: inflexibility, lack of communication, and an apparent need to control other people's lives. It never occurred to Diego that behind that hostile facade lay a completely different person. In fact, Diego was convinced that Bob was simply a bitter old man who had chosen to make his neighbors' lives miserable. Little did he know that a simple winter blizzard was about to completely change that perception. The winter of 2020 brought one of the worst snowstorms New Jersey had seen in years. Diego woke up that February morning to find his yard completely covered in a thick layer of snow that reached almost knee-deep. The wind had blown hard all morning, creating huge drifts against doors and garages. It was the kind of blizzard that paralyzes an entire city, canceling classes, closing offices, and forcing everyone to stay home. Diego looked out the window and sighed, knowing he had a lot of work ahead of him to clear the driveway and the path to the street. After breakfast, Diego and his mother prepared for the arduous task of shoveling snow. Equipped with shovels, gloves, and rubber boots, they began methodically, first clearing a path from the front door to the sidewalk. The work was heavy and tiring, each shovelful of snow weighing down like wet earth. Diego stopped frequently to rest, wiping the sweat from his face despite the intense cold. His mother worked with determination, but he could see that she too was struggling under the weight of the accumulated snow. That's when Diego heard a strange noise coming from next door. Looking up from his shovel, he saw Bob trying to clear his own driveway, but something was clearly wrong. The man moved strangely, as if carrying extra weight on his back, and with each movement he seemed to be fighting an invisible pain. Diego noticed that Bob had some kind of equipment strapped to his body, a structure that ran from his back to below his waist. It was the first time Diego had seen his neighbor up close during the day, and he was shocked by how frail the man seemed. Bob tried to shovel, but it was obvious he couldn't even manage a third of the normal movement. Each attempt to lift the snow was followed by a long pause, as if he needed to recover from the effort. Diego watched for a few minutes, torn between the anger built up over months of conflict and a growing sense that something was very wrong. The man who was causing so much trouble for the neighborhood was clearly not well, and Diego began to feel uncomfortable just watching without offering help. The decision came almost instinctively. Diego put down his shovel, walked over to Bob's property, and without a word began shoveling snow from Bob's driveway. Bob tried to protest, saying he didn't need help and could do it himself, but Diego simply kept working. It was clear Bob's pride was hurt, but it was also obvious he was physically unable to complete the task. Diego worked in silence, focused on clearing not only the driveway, but also a path to the street and around Bob's car. When Diego finished, Bob stood silently for a long moment, clearly conflicted. Then, with slow, careful movements, he took a $20 bill from his pocket and handed it to Diego. It was at that moment that Diego did something that surprised them both. He refused the money and said he wasn't doing it for payment, but simply because it was the right thing to do for someone in need. Bob was visibly moved, and for the first time since Diego had known him, the man smiled. It was a shy, almost hesitant smile, but genuine. In that moment, amidst the snowdrifts and the biting winter cold, a friendship was born that would completely change both men's lives. The days following the blizzard brought a subtle but noticeable change in Bob Martinez's behavior. Diego noticed that the curtains next door now opened occasionally, and sometimes he could catch a glimpse of Bob watching through the window. It was no longer the hostile watchfulness of the first few months, but rather a genuine curiosity, as if Bob were trying to better understand who his neighbors were. Diego began nodding when he saw them, and to his surprise, Bob nodded back. It was a small but significant improvement for two men who had spent months in silent conflict. The first real conversation happened a week later, when Diego was checking the mailbox. Bob left the house to get his own mail, and instead of ignoring Diego as he usually did, he stopped and commented on the weather. The conversation was brief and superficial, but Diego was struck by the change in tone in Bob's voice. The man no longer sounded harsh or irritated, but rather hesitant, like someone who had forgotten how to hold a casual conversation. Diego responded amiably, commenting on how harsh the winter had been this year, and Bob nodded with a small smile. It was during these early interactions that Diego began to notice more details about Bob's physical condition. The equipment he carried on his back was clearly medical equipment, connected by tubes that disappeared beneath his clothing. Bob moved with deliberate care, as if each step were calculated to avoid pain or discomfort. Diego also noticed that Bob had difficulty standing for long periods, often leaning on his cane or the wall of the house. It was clear the man was dealing with a serious health issue, which explained much of his previously hostile demeanor. What struck Diego most was Bob's evident loneliness. During their brief conversations, Bob casually mentioned that he hadn't had visitors in months, that his family was distant, and that most of his old friends had passed away. He spoke matter-of-factly without self-pity, but Diego could sense the melancholy behind his words. It was as if Bob had resigned himself to living in isolation, accepting loneliness as an inevitable part of his life. Diego began to wonder if all that initial hostility was simply Bob's way of coping with the lack of genuine human connection. The conversations gradually became more frequent and somewhat longer. Bob inquired about Diego's work as a wedding photographer, showing genuine interest when Diego mentioned some of the events he had recently covered. Diego was surprised to discover that Bob had considerable photography knowledge, offering technical comments about lenses and camera settings that demonstrated real experience. When Diego inquired about this knowledge, Bob hesitated for a moment before vaguely mentioning that he had worked with cameras in the past, but didn't elaborate. The most significant change came when Bob began making small gestures of neighborliness. He stopped complaining about the usual noise at Diego's house, and even waved when Diego left for work on the weekends. One morning, Diego found his newspaper neatly folded on his doorstep when the delivery man would normally drop it in the middle of the lawn. When he thanked Bob the next day, the man simply shrugged and said he'd just stopped by. Diego began to realize that behind the difficult neighborly facade lay someone who had simply forgotten how to connect with others. The blizzard had not only broken the ice between them, but had also begun to melt the barriers Bob had built around himself over the years. The first invitation to Bob's house came on a rainy March afternoon, when Diego was returning from work, carrying heavy photography equipment. Bob was on the porch checking the mailbox when he saw Diego struggling with his cameras and tripods in the rain. Without hesitation, Bob invited Diego to wait out the rain inside. Diego gratefully accepted, curious to finally see inside the mysterious residence that had intrigued the entire neighborhood for months. When Bob opened the front door, Diego was unprepared for what he would find on the other side. Bob's house was completely different from any normal residence Diego had ever visited. The living room had been transformed into what looked like a professional studio, with large cameras mounted on heavy tripods, studio lights strategically placed, and cables running across the floor. All the windows were covered with blackout fabric, creating a controlled environment where Bob could completely adjust the lighting. Diego was impressed by the quality and quantity of the equipment, which was clearly worth tens of thousands of dollars. It was like discovering that your reclusive neighbor was actually a professional photographer in hiding. Bob noticed the look of surprise on Diego's face and explained that this was his workspace, though he didn't elaborate on what kind of work he did there. Diego noted that there were multiple cameras of different types and eras, from modern digital models to vintage film cameras that looked decades old. There was also a dedicated film processing area, with chemicals and developing equipment that Diego recognized from his college days. The level of sophistication of the setup indicated that Bob was not just a hobbyist, but someone with deep technical knowledge and extensive photography experience. What caught Diego's attention most were the photographs scattered across the tables and pinned to the walls. Even at a glance, he could see they were striking images, many of them in black and white, with an artistic quality that demonstrated Bob's expert eye. There were landscape photos, portraits, and some that appeared to be of events or situations Diego couldn't quite identify. Bob quickly organized some of the photos when he noticed Diego staring, as if he were protecting something private or sensitive. Bob's defensive reaction only heightened Diego's curiosity about his neighbor's true past. During the visit, Diego also noticed that the house was adapted to Bob's physical limitations. There were strategically placed grab bars, a stair lift to access the second floor, and several chairs positioned where Bob could rest during his daily activities. The medical equipment Bob carried had a charging station next to his favorite chair, and several bottles of medication were arranged on a tray within easy reach. It was clear that Bob had carefully organized his home to maintain his independence despite his health limitations. As the rain stopped and Diego prepared to leave, Bob hesitated for a moment before making a comment that would stick in Diego's mind. He said he didn't get many visitors and that it had been interesting to have someone show his work, even if briefly. Bob then asked if Diego would like to come back another day to talk about photography, as they both shared an interest in the field. Diego accepted the invitation enthusiastically, realizing he was being invited into Bob's private world in a way no one had probably been in years. As he left the house, Diego couldn't stop thinking about all the questions that visit had raised about who Bob Martinez really was and what kind of work he had done with all those impressive cameras. Diego's visits to Bob's house became regular, always centered on discussions about photographic techniques and equipment. Bob had an impressive collection of lenses that Diego had only seen in expensive professional catalogs, including 500mm telephoto lenses and wide-angle lenses that cost more than Diego's car. During one of these visits, Bob casually offered to let Diego borrow some lenses for his weddings, as he no longer used them. Diego was shocked by the generosity especially considering that these lenses cost between $5,000 and $8,000 each. It was the kind of equipment Diego rented for $100 a day from specialty stores in Manhattan. Bob demonstrated a depth of technical knowledge that went far beyond that of a typical hobbyist. He could discuss technical specifications of cameras Diego had never operated, explain subtle differences between film types, and offer advice on capturing images in extremely challenging lighting conditions. When Diego mentioned issues he faced at low-light weddings, Bob immediately suggested specific techniques and ISO settings that demonstrated years of practical experience. It was obvious that Bob had worked professionally in photography, but he always avoided giving specific details about where or when he acquired this expertise. The mystery deepened when Diego discovered that Bob also owned professional video equipment, including broadcast cameras typically used by major television networks. There were directional microphones, professional audio recording equipment, and even a complete editing suite with multiple monitors and advanced post-production software. Diego realized he was looking at a setup rivaling many professional studios, raising obvious questions about how Bob had acquired all of this and why it was hidden in a residential home in Summit. During their conversations, Bob occasionally made comments that suggested experience in extreme photographic situations. He mentioned techniques for photographing in wartime conditions, methods for protecting equipment in hostile climates, and strategies for capturing images without detection. When Diego asked about these experiences, Bob always changed the subject or gave vague answers about previous work. Diego began to suspect that Bob had been some kind of photojournalist, possibly covering international conflicts or sensitive political events. The relationship between the two men grew stronger through their shared passion for photography. Bob began offering constructive criticism on Diego's work, helping him improve his technique and artistic approach. Diego noticed a significant change in the quality of his wedding photos after implementing Bob's suggestions. Clients began to praise his work more, and Diego was able to raise his prices due to the improved quality. It was like having an experienced mentor, even though Diego still didn't know exactly what Bob's professional background was. Bob's generosity with his equipment continued to grow. He lent Diego thousands of dollars worth of carbon fiber tripods, professional flashes, and even a backup camera so he could have redundancy during important events. When Diego tried to return the items, Bob would often say, "Keep this, I'm not using it anyway." Diego began to notice that Bob was gradually passing on his equipment to him, as if preparing to no longer need it. The generosity was touching, but also concerning, as it suggested that Bob might be contemplating a future where he would no longer be able to work in photography. Diego wondered if Bob's health condition was more serious than he had initially realized, and if these equipment donations were Bob's way of ensuring his professional tools went to someone who would put them to good use. As the weeks passed, Diego began to learn the human side of Bob Martinez behind all that impressive technology. Bob revealed that he had served in the U.S. Army during his youth, participating in several overseas operations that he never described in detail. When Diego asked about these military experiences, Bob always responded evasively, saying only that he had visited many countries and seen things I'd rather forget. The melancholy tone in his voice suggested that these memories carried significant emotional weight. Diego began to suspect that Bob had been involved in conflicts or operations that left deep scars on his psyche. During their conversations, Bob mentioned that he had been married, but that his wife had died of cancer almost a decade ago. He spoke about her with a tenderness that completely contrasted with his normally reserved personality, describing how patient she had been with his long absences for work and how she had taken care of the house during his periods abroad. Bob revealed that they had never had children, something they always regretted, but which perhaps had been a blessing considering the nature of his work. Bob's loneliness became more understandable when Diego realized he had lost the only person who truly knew and loved him unconditionally. Bob also spoke about his complicated relationship with his family. He had an older brother, Michael, who worked at the Pentagon in some official capacity that Bob never fully specified. The two brothers had grown apart over 20 years ago due to differences over work and life priorities. Bob explained that Michael had always followed a more traditional bureaucratic path, while Bob had chosen field work, which his brother considered reckless and unnecessarily dangerous. The hurt in his voice was evident when Bob mentioned that they stopped speaking after a serious discussion about Bob's career decisions. It was during these personal conversations that Diego began to understand the true extent of Bob's condition. The medical equipment he carried was related to a back problem caused by an old injury, but Bob also revealed that he was dealing with other health complications that he preferred not to detail. Diego noticed that Bob was taking multiple medications throughout the day, had increasing difficulty climbing stairs, and sometimes needed to stop mid-conversation to rest. It was clear that Bob was facing serious health challenges, but his determination to maintain his independence was both admirable and troubling. Bob's personality began to reveal itself through small gestures and comments. Diego discovered that Bob had a dry and witty sense of humor, especially when discussing the idiosyncrasies of small-town American life. Bob also demonstrated an impressive knowledge of international politics and world history, making references to events and people that suggested personal experience rather than mere academic knowledge. When Diego made grammatical errors in English, Bob would gently correct him, demonstrating patience and a genuine interest in helping Diego improve his fluency. What struck Diego most was the gradual shift in Bob's personality as their friendship deepened. The man who had been so hostile and suspicious in the early months was revealing himself as a deeply lonely man who had simply forgotten how to connect with others. Bob began to show genuine interest in Diego's life, asking about his wedding clients, his family in Brazil, and his plans for the future. It was as if Bob was rediscovering the joy of human companionship after years of self-imposed isolation. Diego began to realize that behind the tough ex-military facade lay a man who had spent decades serving his country in ways that would likely never be publicly acknowledged, and who was now facing his golden years completely alone. In the summer of 2020, Diego began to notice a gradual but worrying deterioration in Bob's physical condition. What initially seemed like a simple back problem was revealing itself to be something much more complex and serious. Bob began having difficulty performing simple tasks he had previously been able to do, such as carrying his own mail or standing for more than a few minutes. Diego noticed that Bob now needed to lean on furniture and walls when moving around the house, and that his hands sometimes shook involuntarily. The medical equipment Bob carried seemed to be being used more frequently, and Diego occasionally heard the sounds of machines running coming from next door at night. It was during this period that Bob made his first direct request for Diego's help. One July morning, Bob called asking if Diego could take him to Summit for a haircut, as he didn't feel safe driving alone. Diego immediately agreed, concerned by Bob's admission of his diminished driving ability. During the drive, Diego noticed that Bob had difficulty getting in and out of the car, moving with extreme caution to avoid pain. At the barbershop, Bob needed help climbing the 2 front steps, something that would have been unthinkable just a few months earlier. It was clear that Bob's fierce independence was being forcibly compromised by his deteriorating health. After the barbershop visit, Bob revealed that he also needed to go to the VA hospital regularly for treatments. He explained that he needed to make these visits twice a week and hesitantly asked Diego if he could help with transportation. Diego agreed without hesitation, but became concerned when Bob was unable or unwilling to explain exactly what kind of treatment he was receiving. Bob simply said he was managing some health issues related to his military service and that the VA doctors were monitoring his condition. Bob's vagueness about his medical issues was frustrating, but Diego respected his privacy while secretly worrying about the severity of the situation. Trips to the VA hospital became a regular routine that revealed more about Bob's condition. Diego noticed that the visits were long, sometimes lasting several hours, and that Bob always left visibly tired and occasionally slightly disoriented. During one of these trips, Bob casually mentioned that there were treatment options he was considering, but that he wasn't sure he wanted to go through all that at your age. Diego began to suspect that Bob was facing difficult medical decisions about treatments that could be invasive or have significant side effects. Bob's reluctance to discuss details suggested he was dealing with something serious, possibly life-threatening. As the summer progressed, Bob's needs for assistance increased markedly. He began asking for help with basic household tasks, such as changing light bulbs or moving heavy objects, which he had previously been able to do on his own. Diego also noticed that Bob was eating less and losing weight, his clothing becoming noticeably looser each week. More worryingly, Bob began having episodes of appearing confused or disoriented, especially after taking his medications. During one visit, Diego found Bob sitting in his armchair, looking lost and unable to remember why he had called Diego over. Bob's deteriorating health created a new dynamic in his friendship with Diego. Bob, who had always been the experienced mentor, sharing knowledge and equipment, was now becoming increasingly dependent on Diego's help and companionship. Paradoxically, this role reversal brought the two men even closer. Diego began visiting Bob almost daily, not only to help with practical needs, but also to provide companionship and emotional support. Bob seemed to greatly appreciate these visits, and Diego began to realize that he had become one of Bob's few connections to the outside world. It was a responsibility Diego hadn't sought, but willingly accepted, realizing that Bob truly had no one else to rely on. The moment that would completely change Diego's perception of Bob came during the fall of 2020, when Bob asked for help retrieving some documents from the basement. During all the months of visits, Diego had never gone down to the basement, an area Bob always kept locked and off-limits to visitors. When Bob handed over the key and asked Diego to retrieve a specific box of files, his hands were visibly shaking, and he seemed reluctant to do so. Bob gave very specific instructions about which box to search, emphasizing that Diego should only take that particular box and not touch anything else. Bob's nervousness was palpable, as if he were granting access to something he preferred to keep secret. When Diego descended the basement stairs, he was shocked by what he found. The basement had been converted into a meticulously organized military archive, with filing cabinets stretching from floor to ceiling along 3 walls. There were detailed maps of countries Diego recognized from news reports about international conflicts, including regions of the Middle East, Central America, and parts of Africa. The folders were labeled with codes Diego didn't understand, but which clearly followed some official classification system. It was like discovering a military operations center hidden in the basement of a seemingly normal suburban home. What impressed Diego most were the photographs. There were thousands of them neatly arranged in envelopes, many in black and white, others in faded colors that suggested decades of age. Diego only managed to see a few while searching for the box Bob had requested, but enough to realize they were no ordinary photographs. There were images that appeared to be surveillance footage, photos of people in situations where they clearly didn't know they were being photographed, and some that appeared to be from military or government locations. The technical quality of the photographs was impressive, demonstrating the same level of professional skill Diego had observed in Bob's equipment. While searching for the specific box, Diego accidentally bumped into a folder that fell to the floor, scattering its contents. As he gathered the papers, he couldn't help but notice some documents bearing CIA letterhead and security classification stamps. There were official forms bearing Bob's name, reports dating back decades, and what appeared to be performance evaluations or mission debriefings. Diego quickly gathered everything and put it back in the folder, but the shock of the discovery temporarily paralyzed him. His reclusive neighbor wasn't just an ordinary ex-military man, but had apparently worked for the Central Intelligence Agency in some operational capacity. The most disturbing discovery came when Diego found the box Bob had requested. Next to it was an entire wall dedicated to what appeared to be a personal memorial. There were photographs of people who clearly meant something special to Bob, some with handwritten dedications in multiple languages. There were also military medals and decorations in display cases, including some Diego recognized as highly valuable and significant. It was clear that Bob had served on dangerous and important missions, receiving official recognition for his service, though this recognition was clearly kept secret from the general public. When Diego came up from the basement with the requested box, Bob was waiting in the kitchen with an anxious expression. Diego handed the box over without comment, but Bob immediately realized from the expression on Diego's face that he had seen more than expected. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other in silence, both processing what this discovery meant for their friendship. Bob finally broke the silence by saying simply, "You have questions." It wasn't a question, but a statement, and Diego realized the moment had come when Bob's secrets could finally be revealed. The discovery of the basement had changed everything between them, creating a new dynamic, where Diego now knew he was dealing with someone whose past was far more complex and meaningful than he had ever imagined. In the weeks following the basement discovery, Diego and Bob's relationship entered a delicate phase, where both knew important revelations were pending, but neither knew exactly how to approach the subject. Bob continued to ask for occasional help with documents in the basement, always giving specific instructions on where to find particular items, but now there was an underlying tension in each request. Diego performed these tasks with increasing curiosity, inevitably seeing more fragments of Bob's extensive archive with each visit. It was impossible to ignore the accumulating evidence about his seemingly ordinary neighbor's extraordinary past. During one of these visits to the basement, Diego discovered that Bob's archive was even more impressive than he had initially realized. There were documents dating back over 40 years, suggesting an extremely long career in intelligence operations. Diego saw reports of missions in countries that had been flashpoints during the Cold War, including operations in Eastern Europe, Central America, and several African nations. The corresponding photographs showed Bob at different times in his life, sometimes unrecognizable due to disguises or simply the passage of decades. It was like observing the evolution of a professional spy through generations of international conflicts. What impressed Diego most was the quality and detail of Bob's work. The photographs were not just documentation, but high-level surveillance art. Diego could see that Bob had developed sophisticated techniques for capturing images in extremely difficult situations, including night photography, long-distance surveillance, and documenting people and events in circumstances where discovery would have serious consequences. The equipment in the basement included telescopic lenses, cameras modified to reduce noise, and film processing technology that allowed for field development. It was the archive of someone who had been a master of his craft. Diego also uncovered evidence that Bob had worked not only as an operative, but also as a trainer and mentor to other agents. There were training manuals handwritten by Bob, detailed guides on surveillance and photography techniques, and performance evaluations of other operatives Bob had supervised. Some documents suggested that Bob had been responsible for training a new generation of intelligence officers in modern documentation and surveillance methods. It was clear that Bob had not only been a field operative, but also someone respected enough to shape the agency's practices. The most sensitive discoveries came when Diego found documents related to operations he recognized from history books and documentaries. There was evidence that Bob had been present during significant international events, not as an observer, but as an active participant in operations that influenced the course of world history. Diego saw photographs and reports related to regime changes, peace negotiations, and international crises that had made headlines during his own youth. The realization that his neighbor had been behind the scenes of important historical events was surreal and intimidating. The sheer scale of the archive also revealed the profound isolation Bob had experienced throughout his career. It documented enormous personal sacrifices, relationships that had ended due to the secrecy of his work, family connections that had been severed due to operational needs, and periods of years where Bob had lived under cover of identity in foreign countries. Diego began to understand that Bob's seclusion in Summit was not simply due to retirement, but the result of decades of conditioning to keep secrets and distance himself from personal connections. The man had literally forgotten how to live a normal life because he had spent most of his adult life pretending to be someone he was not. The discovery of this archive not only revealed Bob's extraordinary past, but also explained why he had become so isolated and suspicious in his retirement years. The conversation Diego had been waiting for finally happened on a grey November afternoon, when Bob called him into his living room for a serious talk. Bob had clearly spent days debating internally whether or not to reveal details about his past, and finally decided that Diego deserved to know the truth about who he really was. With a mixture of hesitation and relief, Bob began to tell his story, beginning with his recruitment by the CIA in the 1970s, shortly after completing his regular military service. He explained that he had been selected due to his combination of technical photography skills, fluency in multiple languages, and a psychological profile that indicated aptitude for long-term undercover work. Bob revealed that he had spent most of his career working in what the agency called long-term penetration operations, where agents were placed in countries for years, sometimes decades, to gather intelligence and build networks of informants. He had lived in more than a dozen countries, always under carefully constructed cover identities, documenting political movements, military capabilities, and economic developments that were crucial to U.S. national security. His photography work was not just a hobby, but his primary tool for gathering and transmitting intelligence back to Langley. The sophisticated techniques Diego had admired were the result of years of specialized training and field experience in circumstances where detection meant death or worse. During this revelation, Bob also explained the personal costs of his career choice. He had missed decades of normal life, including opportunities to build lasting relationships, start a family when young, and maintain connections with childhood friends and extended family. His marriage had been one of the few bright spots in his life, but even that had been strained by the demands of constant travel and the inability to share details about his work. Bob admitted that he had been relieved when his wife died, not because he didn't love her, but because her death meant he no longer had to live with the guilt of constantly lying to someone he cared about. Bob also revealed details about some of his most significant operations, though always careful not to divulge information that could still be classified. He had been involved in operations during some of the most critical moments of the Cold War, including work in Eastern Europe during periods of political upheaval, operations in Central America during conflicts in the 1980s, and intelligence gathering in the Middle East during various crises. Some of his photographs had been used in presidential briefings, and his reports had influenced major policy decisions that affected millions of people. It was sobering for Diego to realize that his quiet neighbor had played invisible but important roles in shaping modern history. A revelation mais personal came quando Bob explained por que he havia chosen para tell Diego about his past. Ele admitted que havia initially been suspicious de Diego, even conducting informal background checks através de contacts que still owed him favors. But over time, Bob havia concluded que Diego was genuinely good person, who had shown kindness sem expecting anything in return. Bob explained que ele havia spent years searching para someone he could trust, com his story e his legacy, someone que could understand importance de his work sem being intimidated por it. Diego represented possibility de finally having honest relationship com another human being after decades de deception e isolation. Bob concluiu his revelation by explaining current health situation mais completely. Ele confirmed que estava suffering from advanced leukemia, result de exposure para radiation e chemicals durante his years de fieldwork in various dangerous locations. Treatment options existed, mas foram invasive e offered only modest chances de extending his life by a few years. Bob havia decided que preferred para spend his remaining time in peace, surrounded por memories de his extraordinary life, rather than fighting hopeless battle contra disease in sterile hospital rooms. Ele havia already made peace come his mortality. He was more concerned about what would happen para his lifetime de work and memories after he was gone. Essa revelation explained his generosity, come equipment a growing dependence on Diego's help. He was preparing para transition from active participant in life, para someone ready, para pass on his knowledge, e possessions, para person he trusted. After the initial revelations about his CIA career, Bob began sharing more specific details about some of his most memorable and impactful operations. He told Diego about a particular mission in the 1980s, when he spent 3 years living as a freelance photographer in a Central American country during a period of intense political turmoil. His job was to document military movements and photograph key political figures, but he ended up becoming deeply involved in the lives of the people he was supposed to merely observe. Bob described how difficult it had been to maintain his cover while watching innocent civilians suffer, knowing that he couldn't intervene without compromising his mission and potentially endangering other operations. Bob também revelou alguns dos technical innovations que havia developed durante his career, including methods para hiding cameras em everyday objects, techniques para developing film em field conditions, e ways para transmit photographs back para headquarters using early digital technology. Ele showed Diego some to his custom-modified equipment que he had created para specific missions, including cameras disguised as other objects, and lenses que could capture clear images from extraordinary distances. Estas innovations hadn't just been his job, mas had become his passion, leading para development to techniques que were later adopted pela entire intelligence community. Bob took obvious pride in his technical contributions, which havia extended far beyond his individual operations. Durante estas conversations, Bob também addressed elephant in room regarding his initial hostility toward Diego e his family. Ele explained que after decades de being trained para suspect everyone e trust no one, retirement hadn't automatically turned off those protective instincts. Cada new neighbor, cada unexpected change in his environment, cada deviation from routine triggered alarm bells que had kept him alive during decades de dangerous work. His initial paranoia about Diego's renovations, parties, and daily activities wasn't personal animosity, mas result de conditioning que made him view any unpredictable behavior as potential threat. Bob admitted que it had taken months de observing Diego's consistency, a genuine nature before he could begin para relax his guard. Bob's stories também revelaram depth de sacrifice que his career had demanded, not just from him, mas from people who had tried para build relationships com him. Ele talked about women he had loved, mas couldn't commit para security concerns, friendships que had withered devido para his inability para share anything real about his life, family members who had eventually stopped trying para maintain contact, comme someone who seemed para have no authentic personality. Bob described feeling like he had lived multiple lifetimes as different people, mas never fully gotten para experience being himself. His marriage had been happiest period to his life precisely porque his wife had somehow accepted his limitations, sem demanding explanations he couldn't provide. One of the most poignant revelations came quando Bob described processo de retiring from fieldwork. Ele explained que transition from active operations para civilian life was something para which no training could prepare agents. After decades de constant vigilance, carefully constructed identities, high-stakes decision-making, suddenly finding himself in suburban New Jersey with nothing para do except manage his declining health had been profoundly disorienting. Bob admitted que he had initially hoped para find ways para continue contributing para intelligence community through consulting or training, mas his health problems had made that impossible. Retirement had forced him para confront reality que his extraordinary life was essentially over, and que he would spend his remaining years as just another elderly man with stories que he could never tell. Perhaps most importantly, Bob revealed why he had ultimately decided para trust Diego com these revelations. Ele explained que after months de careful observation, he had concluded que Diego possessed combination de qualities que made him suitable para knowing truth, genuine compassion sem naivete, ability para keep confidences sem being sworn para secrecy, a practical nature que allowed him para accept complex realities sem needing para judge or change them. Bob also admitted que he had been searching para years para someone para whom he could safely entrust certain aspects to his legacy, including photographs and documents que told important stories about U.S. intelligence operations mas couldn't be officially declassified. Diego represented opportunity para Bob para ensure que some record to his work would survive in hands to someone who understood its significance, sem being bound by government restrictions about what could be shared com future generations. No inverno de 2021, a condição de Bob deteriorou dramaticamente. O que havia sido declínio gradual suddenly accelerated, e Diego found himself providing increasingly intensive care para his aging friend. Bob's ability para climb stairs disappeared completely, forcing Diego para help him convert first floor de sua casa into makeshift bedroom and living area. Equipment que Bob had once operated effortlessly now sat unused as his hands trembled too much para operate delicate camera controls. His eyesight began para fail him. Diego watched helplessly as this man who had lived such extraordinary life was reduced para struggling com most basic daily activities. Durante este período, Bob made several important decisions about his final arrangements. Ele gave Diego power of attorney para handle his affairs, explaining que his estranged brother Michael was his only living relative, mas lived too far away, it would be too uncomfortable dealing com practical aspects to Bob's death. Bob também provided detailed instructions about what should happen para his extensive archives, specifying que certain materials should be returned para government authorities, while others could be kept por Diego as historical record. Most importantly, Bob insisted que Diego take ownership to all his photography equipment, noting que these tools should continue para be used por someone who would appreciate their quality of history. The visits para VA hospital became daily occurrences, com Diego accompanying Bob para increasingly serious treatments and consultations. Bob's leukemia had progressed. Parapoint Onda standard treatments were no longer effective. The doctors began discussing palliative care options. Durante uma dessas visits, Bob finally admitted para Diego that he had been declining aggressive treatment options para months, preferring para let disease run its course rather than extend his suffering through painful procedures that offered little hope to meaningful recovery. Diego struggled come this revelation, understanding Bob's reasoning mas wishing there was something more that could be done. Bob's personality began para change as his condition worsened. Man who had always been stoically controlled started para show more emotion, occasionally tearing up quando discussing memories de his late wife or expressing gratitude para Diego's friendship. Ele also became more reflective about his career, sometimes expressing regret about sacrifices he had made para serve his country. During one particularly difficult evening, Bob admitted that he sometimes wondered whether his lifetime de service had been worth price he had paid in personal relationships and normal experiences. These moments de vulnerability were jarring para Diego, who had come para see Bob as almost invincible figure. As Bob's physical condition declined, he began para experience episodes de confusion and disorientation that were frightening para both men. Sometimes Bob would forget where he was, or become convinced that he was still on mission in foreign country. Durante these episodes, Diego learned para remain calm, and gently guide Bob back para reality, using techniques that Bob himself had taught him during their conversations about dealing with stress and maintaining psychological stability during difficult situations. These moments highlighted just how much Bob's mind had been shaped for decades to training and experience, that were completely outside normal human experience. The end came suddenly in early February 2022. Diego arrived for his daily visit, but to find Bob unconscious in his favorite chair, having apparently suffered some kind of medical crisis during night. Paramedics were called, but Bob never regained consciousness before being transported para hospital. Diego rode com him in ambulance, holding his friend's hand and talking para him, hoping that somewhere in his unconscious state, Bob could hear words de comfort and appreciation. At hospital, doctors explained that Bob had suffered massive system failure related para his leukemia, and that his condition was irreversible. Diego was faced com prospect de saying goodbye para man who had become like family para him, knowing that Bob's extraordinary life was finally coming para its end. Bob remained in a coma for 7 days in the hospital, during which Diego kept a near constant vigil at his side. On the 7th day, to the surprise of all the doctors, Bob temporarily regained consciousness, though he was visibly weak and nearing his end. When he saw Diego sitting beside his bed, Bob managed a small smile and, in a weak but determined voice, said he had something important to do. With great effort, Bob asked Diego to turn on his cell phone camera and record a final message. It was as if Bob had awakened specifically to complete this final mission, using his final strength to ensure that his last wishes were properly documented. The recording Bob made that day in the hospital would become one of the most emotional and surprising moments of Diego's life. In a shaky but clear voice, Bob officially declared that he was leaving all his photography equipment, including cameras, lenses, and accessories, to Diego Martinez, acknowledging that Diego had become not only his closest friend, but also someone who would put these professional tools to good use. Bob specified that Diego had the right to do whatever he wanted with these items, sell them, use them, or donate them, and that they became Diego's responsibility from that moment on. The generosity of the gesture completely touched Diego, especially considering the financial and sentimental value of the equipment. But the recording didn't stop there. Bob also revealed that he had made legal arrangements for Diego to inherit his Summit home, explaining that he had no one else in his life who deserved or needed the property. He had worked with a lawyer over the previous months to ensure all legal documents were in order, including the transfer of title and the settlement of any outstanding debts. Bob explained that he wanted Diego to have the opportunity to build a stable life in the United States, and that the house was his way of saying thank you for the years of friendship and care Diego had provided. During the recording, Bob also gave specific instructions on how Diego should deal with his brother Michael, who lived in Washington, D.C., and worked at the Pentagon. Bob explained that Michael would likely come to Summit after his death to handle matters related to the classified files in the basement, and that Diego should cooperate fully with any requests Michael made. Bob emphasized that some materials in his home were U.S. government property and would need to be returned to the appropriate authorities, but that other photographs and documents could remain with Diego as a personal historical record. The most touching part of the recording came when Bob expressed his gratitude for Diego's friendship. With tears in his eyes, Bob said that Diego had given him something no one else could provide in the last years of his life: genuine companionship with no hidden agenda, care without expectation of reward, and acceptance of who he truly was without judgment about his past. Bob explained that Diego had restored his faith in basic human kindness after decades of working in a world where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He said that knowing Diego had made his final years not only tolerable but genuinely happy. At the end of the recording, Bob made a final personal request. He asked Diego to contact Michael after his death and tell him about his religious conversion and growing faith in God during his final years. Bob explained that he and Michael had been raised in a secular family and that his newfound spirituality had been largely influenced by conversations with Diego about faith and purpose. Bob wanted his brother to know that he had found peace in his final days, not only through morphine for physical pain, but through the spiritual comfort Diego had helped him discover. This revelation was particularly meaningful for Diego, who had shared his own Christian faith with Bob during many of their conversations, never imagining that these discussions had had such a profound impact on his friend's final perspective on life and death. After Bob's death, Diego faced the overwhelming responsibility of carrying out his friend's last wishes while processing his own grief. The first step was to contact Michael Martinez, Bob's brother, who immediately traveled from Washington, D.C. to Summit upon learning of his death. The meeting between Diego and Michael was initially tense, as Michael was suspicious of Diego's motives and worried that someone might have taken advantage of his sick brother. However, when Diego showed him the hospital recording and explained in detail how his friendship with Bob had developed, Michael's demeanor changed completely. He realized that Diego genuinely cared about Bob and had been instrumental in making his brother's final years bearable. Michael reveló details sobre Bob's career que even Bob hadn't shared com Diego. Hale confirmed que Bob havia been one de CIA's most valuable operatives durante Cold War era, specializing in long-term undercover operations que required extraordinary psychological resilience and technical skills. Michael explained que Bob's work havia contributed para several major intelligence successes, que couldn't be publicly acknowledged, mas que had significantly advanced U.S. interests in critical regions during dangerous periods. Michael also revealed that Bob had been offered multiple opportunities para transition para administrative roles que would have been safer and more conducive para normal family life, mas que Bob had always chosen para remain in field work porque he believed his skills were most valuable there. The process to clearing Bob's house became a complex logistical operation involving multiple government agencies. Michael coordinated com representatives from CIA and other organizations para identify and remove materials que were still classified or belonged para government. Diego watched in amazement as teams de specialists spent 3 days going through Bob's basement archive, using industrial paper shredders para destroy documents que couldn't be allowed para enter public domain. At the same time, Michael was careful para ensure que Diego received everything que Bob had intended para him, including personal photographs, equipment, and historical materials que weren't subject para classification restrictions. Durante this process, Diego discovered just how thoroughly Bob had researched his background before deciding para trust him. Hidden in Bob's files was comprehensive dossier on Diego, including background checks, employment history, even interviews from people who knew him in Brazil. Bob had used his intelligence contacts para verify Diego's character and motivations before gradually revealing his own secrets. Rather than feeling violated by this investigation, Diego was impressed by Bob's thoroughness. It touched que he had ultimately passed Bob's rigorous evaluation. It demonstrated how seriously Bob had taken decision para bring Diego into his confidence. Michael shared stories about Bob's earlier life que helped Diego understand how his friend had become such isolated figure. Ailey described how Bob had always been intensely private, even as child, and how his recruitment into intelligence work had amplified these natural tendencies para a point where maintaining normal relationships became nearly impossible. Michael admitted he and Bob had drifted apart, not apenas because the disagreements about Bob's career choices, mas because Bob had become increasingly difficult para connect with on personal level. Michael expressed regret it had taken Bob's death para fully appreciate sacrifices his brother had made in service para their country. The funeral arrangements revealed final surprise about Bob's character. Despite his decades to government service and significant contributions para national security, Bob had specifically requested simple, private service no military honors or official recognition. Ela had wanted para be remembered simply as Robert Martinez, not as intelligence operative classified achievements. Only Diego, Michael, a few VA hospital staff who had cared para Bob attended service. After cremation, Michael and Diego scattered Bob's ashes in small garden behind his house in Summit, location where Bob had spent his happiest retirement moments watching Diego work in his own yard next door. It was fitting tribute para a man who had devoted his professional life para protecting others from shadows. Maski had found his greatest personal peace, simple pleasure to human connection durante his final years. 2 years after Bob's death, Diego still lives in the house he inherited in Summit, New Jersey, but his life was completely transformed by the experience of meeting and caring for his extraordinary neighbor. The photography equipment Bob left him allowed Diego to significantly expand his wedding photography business, offering professional quality that few photographers in the region can match. More important than financial success, however, was the emotional and spiritual impact that Bob's friendship had on Diego's character and outlook on life. Diego often reflects on how the simple act of helping a neighbor shovel snow led to one of the most meaningful relationships in his life. The house Bob left Diego serves as a constant reminder of the lessons he learned about service, sacrifice, and the importance of human connection. Diego keeps Bob's former studio area largely unchanged, preserving some of his mentor's photographs and equipment as a memorial to a man who had lived such an extraordinary hidden life. Occasionally, Diego uses the space to edit his own wedding photos, feeling Bob's presence and guidance as he works with tools that carry the weight of decades of professional expertise. The house also serves as a testament to the generosity of spirit that can develop between people when barriers of suspicion and misunderstanding are broken down through genuine kindness. Michael Martinez maintained regular contact com Diego, visiting Summit several times per year para check in casa y share memories de Bob. Through estas visits, Diego has learned even more about Bob's career and impact his work had in shaping modern history. Michael has also shared some de Bob's unclassified photographs com Diego, images que document important historical events from unique perspective to someone who was present whose role couldn't be publicly acknowledged. These photographs serve como a reminder that history is shaped not only by famous leaders or celebrities, mas também por countless unsung individuals who work behind scenes para protect the advance interests to their nations. Diego's experience com Bob also fundamentally changed his approach para relationships com other people. Having learned how isolation and mistrust can develop in someone's life, Diego now makes conscious effort para reach out para neighbors and community members who might be struggling com loneliness or health problems. Ele volunteers at local VA hospital, using skills he developed caring para Bob, para assist other elderly veterans who lack family support. Diego has found that many of these men have extraordinary stories to service and sacrifice. Mas que social isolation prevents them from sharing these experiences com younger generations who could benefit from their wisdom and perspective. Perhaps most significantly, Diego's friendship com Bob taught him about power de unconditional acceptance in non-judgmental support. When Diego first learned about Bob's career and intelligence, he could have reacted com fear, suspicion, or moral judgment about work that necessarily involved deception and sometimes violence. Instead, Diego chose para see Bob as complete human being whose professional choices were separate from his intrinsic worth as person. This ability para accept Bob without trying, para change him, or demand explanations, allowed their friendship para develop in way que brought peace para both men. Diego has tried para apply this same acceptance in his relationships com family members, clients, and community members who have different backgrounds and experiences. A lasting impact de Bob's influence in Diego's life continues para manifest in unexpected ways. Diego has begun writing book about his experience, carefully avoiding details that might compromise national security, mas focusing on human story to how two very different men found connection across barriers de age, culture, and life experience. Ele hopes que sharing this story might encourage other people para look beyond surface appearances, and reach out para neighbors who might seem difficult or unfriendly, recognizing que extraordinary kindness and wisdom can be hidden behind protective facades que people develop para cope com past trauma or present isolation. Diego's life was forever changed by decision para help elderly neighbor remove snow from his driveway, proving que smallest acts de compassion can lead para most profound transformations, and both giver and receiver de such kindness. This story teaches us something fundamental about human nature. We never truly know who the people next door are. The seemingly impossible neighbor may be carrying decades of sacrifice in service to the country. The person who complains about everything may be struggling with loneliness and a terminal illness. The stranger who avoids contact may be desperately hoping for someone to show a little genuine kindness. Diego transformed Bob's life simply by being human at the right moment. It wasn't a heroic or planned gesture. It was simply an instinctive decision to help someone in need during a blizzard. But this moment of compassion broke 40 years of isolation for a man who had served his country in silence, without recognition, without family, without anyone to tell his extraordinary story. And in return, Bob gave Diego much more than expensive equipment or a home. He gave him a completely new perspective on what it means to live with purpose. The recording you heard in the hospital represents something greater than a testament. It's a testament to the fact that authentic human connection can happen between the most unlikely people, in the most unexpected circumstances. Bob spent decades trained to distrust everyone, but he found in Diego something his CIA career never could: friendship without agenda, care without expectation of return, and complete acceptance of who he truly was. Now, I need your help spreading this message. If this story touched your heart like it did mine, please leave a like now. That's how I know you want more real stories like this. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit that subscribe button and activate the bell, because every week I bring you stories that will change your perspective on life and the people around you. In the comments, I want to know, where are you watching this video from? Write your city and country and tell me if you've ever had a similar experience with a neighbor or stranger who ended up surprising you. Who's the difficult neighbor in your life who might just be waiting for a gesture of kindness? Your stories can inspire others to be more compassionate, so be sure to share. And please share this video with at least one person you love, because in an increasingly divided and distrustful world, we need to remember that humanity still exists in the most unexpected places. Perhaps by inspiring others to be more compassionate, we can create a chain of kindness that transforms not only individual lives, but entire communities. Thank you so much for watching until the end, and we'll see you in the next video with more stories that will stir your emotions.